And together, the four of us really just want to take a little bit of stock of, as I said, where we're at, and also look at some of the exciting developments and sort of the actual emerging topics within this larger cluster of conflict that are currently on our agenda. We're trying to do this as interactive as possible. Of course, we will start with some of the inputs from each of us, but we will also intersperse it with a couple of additional insights and experiences from anticipatory action practitioners working on conflict-affected settings throughout. So we brought a couple of videos just to provide some of those perspectives from the ground and from the really hands-on work as well. So we have an hour. We'll see how well that is going to work. Ideally, at the end, we will then also have, if we all stick to our time, roughly 20 minutes for a bit of a discussion. So the first big question, why are we having this conversation now? Part of this is, as I already mentioned, we are now at the roughly 5-year mark of very specifically talking about anticipatory action and conflict. And that is through the working group, that is through different publications that have come out on this topic. And some of you who have been working on this this theme before might be familiar with a working paper that our third co-chair of the working group, Catalina Jaime, wrote together with Marie Wagner as one of the very, very first knowledge product, essentially, so discussion pieces on anticipatory action and conflict. And that was in 2020. It doesn't feel like it's 5 years ago, but it has actually been 5 years by now. So recently, within the working group, we decided actually it's time for a bit of a check-in to really see what have we learned over the last couple of years. And we put that together across the working group as a briefing for the Anticipation Hub that was published 2 months ago, I believe. And so as the starting point for today, I would just very, very briefly take you through this briefing to give you an overview of kind of where the thinking is at right now, what we have learned, and sort of what those topics are that we want to continue working on in the future. With that, we're starting the first very brief presentation. Bear with me, it's not going to be very long. Just on this briefing itself, I will put the link in the chat in just a second after I'm done with this, so you will still pay attention to me. As we were trying to figure out what the current sort of status is on the discussions on anticipatory action, both in conflict-affected settings, but also very specifically for conflict-affected settings and conflict impacts to some extent, we sort of, through several discussions in the working group, identified 3 key themes that play a role for us and that play a role in this briefing. So they basically structure the contents, being on how we integrate conflict into anticipatory action frameworks. How do we approach sort of this notion of conflict on the topic of anticipatory action? One is just very practically, what are the operational realities for anticipatory action in conflict-affected settings? And then the third part is sort of just going a little bit broader. How do we might have to rethink what we have previously done on anticipatory action, just to ensure that what we're doing and our ways of working are really fit for purpose in conflict settings? So let me just get you very, very quickly through those 3 key themes. As we were thinking about how to integrate conflict into anticipatory action frameworks, there are really two big elements to that. One is this notion of conflict as a driver of risk, which I think we talk about quite a lot in terms of how conflict undermines the ability of communities to deal with different hazards, how it undermines resilience, and how it might exacerbate vulnerabilities. So this is a part that Deborah and Tim will go into a little bit more in a second on how do we design anticipatory action systems in multi-risk environments, in very complex environments. The other side to it is then, how do we consider conflict itself as a hazard? Can we anticipate conflict? Can we anticipate conflict impacts? And if so, can we integrate that into our anticipatory action frameworks? Those are basically those two parts to this discussion. Um, Again, of designing anticipatory action for multi-risk settings, as I just mentioned, and then going a little bit further in terms of the actual design of anticipatory action and what kind of trigger approaches are actually available that go a little bit further than what we are used to from sort of the very traditional climate hazard focused anticipatory action that really takes weather forecasts, for example, that takes sort of very clear cut quantitative forecasts, quantitative models, and to go to something that is maybe a little bit more mixed methods that includes different qualitative elements, and how can those kind of trigger approaches look. Second point that I think we spend a lot of time over the last couple of years talking about is really the operational realities. How do we make anticipatory action in conflict-affected settings not just effective and so really fit for purpose, but also conflict sensitive? How do we ensure that whatever we're doing is not making any situation worse and ideally contributes to social cohesion, for example, really contributes to resilience beyond just protecting people from hazards. Some of the topics that came up as we were discussing this in the working group, and then also as part of the argumentation in the briefing, were questions on how do we navigate humanitarian access constraints, how do we collaborate with different local actors, that can be civil society, that can be authorities, that so there's a very wide spectrum of local actors that we could engage with. Some of them might be coming with ethical dilemmas, so we're also looking a little bit at that element. Um, and then really on the more practical side, how do we conduct feasibility assessments and how do we include contingency planning to ensure that we are properly prepared for the operational realities we might be facing? And how do we prioritize protection elements and conflict sensitivity in everything that we do to protect the communities that we're actually serving? We then have a last part that looks at the funding element of it, because I think also that is a discussion we've had more over the last, especially 1.5 years, thanks to some of the progresses at the COPs. There is more discussion now on both climate finance, but also generally disaster risk related financing for conflict affected settings. And so there is a question of how can anticipatory action actually link into that. If you're interested in that element a little bit more, we had a community conversation last year that very specifically looked at the role of the COP peace declaration and the commitments to increasing funding to conflict affected countries and how anticipatory action could make use of that. You can find that one on YouTube on the Anticipation Hub website. And once I'm done talking, I can also just put the link in the chat for you to check it out. And then sort of the third element that I mentioned initially is this whole notion of, do we have to rethink anticipatory action to some extent to really make it fit for purpose in conflict affected settings? And I think part of that goes to the whole discussion on trigger approaches, but also in a wider sense of maybe anticipatory action is not as clear cut as we originally thought or as we originally imagined it. And we've seen quite some organizations now actually doing very, very impressive work on just thinking a little bit broader on what anticipatory action can mean, sort of what an anticipatory mindset might be, and how we can use that to make humanitarian assistance, but also programming in a broader sense, just sort of more proactive. The other part is that we also need to look inwards. We actually need to consider whether we as the organizations doing anticipatory action are really ready to work on some very complex, very dynamic settings, such as conflict affected settings. So there are questions just related to our own institutional capacity, our own risk appetite, and our willingness to be flexible in those settings. And so just to figure out whether we are actually in a position where we can provide the right environment to make anticipatory action work in conflict affected settings. And then lastly, something that I think we've been doing a lot more over the last few years with the working group is to really see how can we, I call it activating, but how can we really leverage this notion of the humanitarian development piece nexus for anticipatory action? How can we pull in different actors, different organizations, and different sets of expertise to help us improve anticipatory action programming in conflict-affected settings? So can bring in peace-building actors, for example, that can tell us some more about their own experiences in those kind of settings and what they have been doing over the last couple of years. So that in a nutshell is this briefing. I'm a little bit biased, but obviously I highly recommend you check it out if you haven't yet. You can find it at the QR code, and I will put you the link to it in the chat in a second as well. If there's anything that strikes your interest a little bit more, we are always very, very happy to discuss it in more detail, be that through the working group or any of the authors directly. Oh, and I see Christina already put the link to the previous community conversation as well. Thanks a lot for that. So yeah, we are now at the point where we have this briefing. We have a couple of other resources that came out over the last, I want to say, roughly 18 months, where we've seen a lot of movement on conflict-related topics. There's a new toolkit on anticipatory action in fragile, conflict-affected, and violent settings that will be available on the Anticipation Hub website imminently. That was produced with the support of the working group by the Climate Center and the International Water Management Institute through the CGR Fragility, Conflict, and Migration Initiative. So we're getting better and better, I think, at really putting resources out there and building on our learnings. But at the same time, I would say from my own impressions, there's still quite a way to go. There are still a lot of new topics that we find as sort of the new emerging topic. So going back to the original title of this community conversation, I think conflict itself has emerged by now, but there are still sort of smaller emerging themes within conflict that we want to continue working on over the next few years. And yeah, we're going to talk about some of those today in this community conversation. And I think with that, maybe Deborah, Tim, I can pass it over to you to tell us a little bit more about the current thinking with regard to compound risk.
Sure. Thank you, Juliane. Great intro, because very relevant to a lot of things that we'll be speaking about just now as well, including the anticipatory mindset. And just trying to get my screen shared as well. I think that should be working now. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. So yeah, I'll be speaking to you today together with my colleague Tim Bishop, who works at Insecurity Insight. My name is Deborah. I work at Action Against Hunger Germany. And together with some other partners, with Welthungerhilfe, with Chatham House, and with two local partners, Practical Action from Bangladesh and Crudan from Nigeria, we have been... Sorry, my dog just got very upset. We have been developing a paper. We were holding a session at the Global Dialogue Platform in Berlin back in October, and based on the content of the session, we're developing the paper that you see here and that we'll also be sharing in the chat that looks at demystifying, compounding, and cascading hazards in anticipatory action with a specific focus on food insecurity. Okay. So the GDP session, as I said, took place in October, and the starting point for the session was really to say that to date, a lot of the anticipatory action initiatives have focused on natural hazards and often on a single hazard at one time. But when we think about what shapes food security, it's really impacted by this interplay of many different factors that are cascading and compounding, including conflict, climate, and economic factors. So Tim, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Deborah. So this is a visual that we came up with at Insecurity Insight, which I think in many ways encapsulates what we were trying to think about in the paper that we collaborated on. And the idea of it really is to visualize the system level links between conflict events directly related to food security and their impacts on food security. So for example, in the red on the left-hand side, you can see what we would term as food-related violence. So for example, the looting of livestock, the deliberate burning of granaries. And then if you move across into the green, you can see impacts that we might expect to foresee. This is very much applied to the context of Mali, for which this visual was developed, but a similar approach could be applied to other contexts too. And how it relates to what we are discussing today is the fact that, for example, you can see going from one impact to another. So, for example, if livestock is looted, particularly vulnerable communities may be thereby deprived of their livelihoods, which then may result in forced displacement in some cases, which then also may result in increased pressure on grazing or agricultural land, for example. So you can see they're cascading. So one impact is translating into another negative impact. And at the same time, they're also compounding because they're occurring at the same time and they're interacting together, and progressively it's exacerbating the negative impacts. And overall, the idea that we were trying to present here is that if you go from the initial stage of the violence occurring right at the start, and then if you go over to the right-hand side where you see the worst effects for food security, what we would try to foster is the idea that relevant stakeholders apply a sort of anticipatory mindset whereby they foresee what impacts you may expect to occur, and ideally, where possible, take conflict-sensitive actions and interventions and encourage positive coping mechanisms, for example, which can mitigate these risks before their worst effects materialize. Thank you. I'll pass back to Deborah now.
Thanks. And so in the paper, we were looking at a few practical examples of how this manifests in practice. We were looking, for example, at the case of Ukraine and how the conflict escalation there had negative effects on global food prices and created shocks to the global food system for many different countries. So those cascading impacts is something that even if we think about conflict and are conflict sensitive in our programming, often we don't think about what might happen in a country A because of what's happening in another country B. At the same time, we were looking at how those things also interact just within individual countries, looking at the examples of Bangladesh and Nigeria, where Bangladesh is struggling with climate extremes, saline institution, and that also lead to compounding food insecurity, and Nigeria, where we see, on the one hand, climate change intensifying compounding hazards such as drought, but the drought also leading to dwindling land and water resources, which then in turn can create conflict between farmers and herders, can lead to displacement, and other impacts also regarding WASH, for example, when there's floods, which are also affecting the country, having waterborne diseases. So I guess what we were trying to say is that very often conflict can, of course, be an individual hazard that has, its own right to pay attention to, but very often it is a risk that interacts with many other risks that are shaping the outcome of interest, which in our case was food security. So some of the key takeaways from the paper were, on the one hand, that shocks caused by climate and conflict can cascade and negatively affect other geographic areas within the global food system. So this would be the Ukraine example, that we really require a systems thinking approach to understand how food insecurity can cascade along different nodes of the food system and to identify opportunities for intervention. This is both visualized in the graph that Tim was just sharing, and Chatham House has done a couple of publications that looks in more depth at this as well. That there's a need for conflict sensitivity, of course, but also really this need for multi-hazard monitoring and early warning systems, which often don't exist yet in an integrated manner, and that actually impact-based forecasting can be a means to help us to account for multi-risks. Because when we think about the impact, we already create a little bit of an open space to consider that it can be multiple risks that are driving a particular impact. And so in terms of how this can be practically done in the paper, we're exploring also a few different examples. One being statistical modeling, and another one being context monitoring, as two ways of exploring how we can do a multi-risk analysis that is also conflict sensitive. So I'll speak about one example briefly. I think I've spoken to this group before in more depth, so it will be very high level today. But again, I'm sure we can find recordings or if not, reach out if you want further details. But at Action Against Hunger, we have one project around modeling early risk indicators to anticipate malnutrition, in short, MARIAM. And it's really geared towards this idea of accounting for complexity in malnutrition when we try to forecast malnutrition. So it is really this idea of the impact-based forecast, because when we think about malnutrition, of course, it doesn't happen from one day to another. It doesn't happen in, just like that in a rapid onset hazard, for example. But different things that are happening, including slow onset phenomena like drought, plus other things that are happening in a country, including conflict, can adversely affect malnutrition prevalence and caseloads. And so the idea here is that we try to understand better not only what are the risk factors, but how different risk factors interact and ultimately drive the outcome. And then so this is our sort of challenge coming up, is how do we then link this to anticipatory action? So the early warning capacity would be there for the forecast to say these are areas that will likely face heightened levels of acute malnutrition among children under 5. How do we link this to anticipatory action mechanisms where we can say, okay, we have this information and maybe with quite a long warning horizon. So what would be good means of then acting with an anticipatory mindset in mind, and not waiting until we basically have the crisis to then say, okay, the proof is there, people are malnourished, we will now engage. And of course, this is maybe, again, broadening a little bit. I think it's something that we'll be talking about more today as well, is that maybe the traditional approach to anticipatory action has been a little bit more narrow. For example, wanting to have already ideally in place the ready protocols, the pre-agreed financing, etc. A lot of this works on the assumption that warning horizons are quite short, and unless we have everything prepared and ready in place, we cannot act. What we were discussing as part of the group working on a paper is that when it comes to food insecurity, sometimes we do have a little bit more time, and that might actually also be a window of opportunity to set up things in a way where even when we have the warning, there might still be some time to put things in place where there isn't a ready protocol or prearranged finance in place. So it's maybe also an interesting perspective to think about it, that in these contexts and also conflict contexts, maybe there are some instances where we have that flexibility. So with that, I hand it back to Tim.
Thank you. So this slide, or this second example, is really what we've been doing at Insecurity Insight in terms of context monitoring for anticipatory action. And what we've been doing essentially is monitoring instances of food-related violence, such as the looting of livestock or deliberate burning of granaries, violence at markets that I discussed earlier on. We've been using open sources as well of partner contributions to do this. And we've been producing a series of briefings, 5 region-specific ones that we published last year, and more recently we also published a sort of review of 2024. And in each of these we examine key trends in these instances, as well as trying to consider some of the foreseeable impacts that may arise from this. And overall, what we've been trying to do is to encourage this anticipatory action mindset that we've mentioned earlier, in terms of considering the foreseeable consequences of instances of food-related violence and how proactive measures can be taken to mitigate these before they fully materialize. So overall, it's very much context monitoring, and it's about trying to foster a different mindset, and it's also about supporting the efficiency of anticipatory action generally in a more sort of soft trigger manner overall. And I think in the current context, the data side of things is really, really important, given the sort of funding situation and potentially critical data shortages that are arising in many contexts. So with that, thank you, and I'll pass you back to either Deborah if there's anything you'd like to add more.
I think with that, it's back to Juliane.
Yeah, thank you.
Amazing. Thank you for this overview. And I think it really highlights this element of different hazards really coming together to cause a joint impact, essentially. And we're seeing now this shift towards, as you mentioned, really looking into impact-based action, so that we don't just try to design anticipatory action for one single hazard, when that hazard might actually not be sort of the sole driver of a certain impact you want to mitigate, which I think is a broader discussion that goes beyond conflict itself, but is a conversation that I think we can take at least a little bit of credit for in terms of putting on the anticipatory action agenda, to really think about how different dynamics, particularly in these very complex, very dynamic, very fragile settings, lead to humanitarian impacts that we're trying to mitigate through our work. Johnson, I saw a hand up if there is a question. Maybe for the moment I can direct you to the chat if there's clarification questions for Deborah or Tim, and then we can pick it up in the discussion afterwards, just so we can get through sort of the different ignites for the moment. I do want to, before we move on to Lena, I want to quickly call in, essentially, one of the more sort of practitioner-focused perspectives, bringing in a video that we shot at the Global Dialogue platform last year, to really offer a bit of a grounded impression on some of the topics that Deborah just talked about, and that considers compound risk relationships, or sort of multi-risk environments, but also how we really implement conflict-sensitive anticipatory action. So for that, I will switch over to hearing from our dear colleague from CARE in the Philippines, Ansharina. If everything goes as we'd like it, you will see that in just a second. These are also videos that are available on YouTube now. They will be part of the toolkit that is about to be published. So I will also put the link in the chat if you want to watch it afterwards again in your own time. I'll put this up here and just give me a signal if there's any issues, if you can't actually hear the sound, if the video is being weird, just let me know.
Hi. The video's being weird. It's like shifting and there's no sound. Maybe start it again.
Let's start that again, and maybe I'm just not allowed to mute myself.
Hi, I'm Catalina Jaime. I'm the head of the climate and conflict team at the Conflict Center and leading on anticipatory action in conflict settings. And we're doing a series of videos to reflect the experience of a lot of the participants from the Anticipatory Action Dialogue platform. We want to put a lot of these like learnings and experiences within a toolkit that we are developing, really help a lot of the people that is out there trying to set up anticipatory action systems in the most conflict settings in the world.
One of the key challenges that we continue to navigate is having that sound analysis of the risks, bringing in together and analyzing climate-related hazards, the different layers of vulnerabilities, and of course the nuances, the sensitivities of the conflict setting, and how it's different from context to context, from place to place. And you need to have a good understanding of that to be able to be effective, I guess, in whatever work, and especially for anticipatory action. One of the experiences and maybe the strengths of one of the projects that we are working in Access is the presence of variety of partners. We're currently composed of 15 organizations. 5 of them are international and 10 of them are local organizations who bring in this expertise, their long established presence in the communities, working on development, working on preparedness, working also on peace building, because especially in this context, that knowledge, that experience is very valuable on anticipatory action. I think one of the lessons that we've had is to not look at it separately. You know, we look at natural hazards, we look at conflict, we look at the environment, but to the people that we are working with, it doesn't matter what those are. What matters is how it's affecting their families, on food insecurity, on their ability to send their children to school. So we have to take it as a whole. We have to understand the different bits and pieces, but you have to be careful not to separate them. And when you have that comprehensive understanding, then it enables us to determine what are the different actions that can be done. It can be preparedness, it can be anticipatory action. Some of it can be more development oriented. Sometimes it's peace building that needs to be done first before anything else. And another thing is that it doesn't have to only be us or the consortium we are working with. There are many partners in the field, and we need to be able to work with them to provide that comprehensive solution, because as individuals, we cannot solve everything. So we need that coordination and that collaboration. One is collaborating with our peace building intervention. So looking at the conflict risk analysis, making sure that it's gender sensitive, because that forms part of the overall risk analysis. Because without that understanding, the efforts would be to nil, and you will not really be able to identify anticipatory action protocols, like the proper timing, how to make sure that it doesn't cause harm to anyone. So that's bringing together of the different capacities and expertise of the people that we work with is key.
All right, I hope that came through somewhat well. I also put the link again in the chat if you want to rewatch the video. I'm putting it in the chat right now. And as I said, these are all available from the toolkit that is about to be published on the Anticipation Hub website. I think one thing that Angelina talked about that was very interesting is this notion of collaborating with different kinds of actors to strengthen both our understanding of the context and also the kinds of actions that we can take in the communities and how we can strengthen our own conflict sensitivity and the effectiveness of different actions, particularly collaborating with peace builders, which from a humanitarian perspective, I think it's still relatively new territory for quite some of us, which is a nice moment to pass the mic over to Lena, who I believe is hiding somewhere on and off camera right now.
No, totally on camera. Thanks, Juliana. Hi everyone. I'm Lena. I'm the global lead on anticipatory action with the Danish Refugee Council. And Juliana, I don't know, were you done? Sorry with the introduction. Did you want to do a bit of a
No,
seat setting?
yeah, take it away, taking us a little bit more into this topic of sort of conflict, peace building, all of the things we could do within anticipatory action.
Exactly. So yeah, Juliana asked me to do a bit of a session debrief from the HMPW that happened a couple of weeks ago in Geneva, in which we hosted a session titled Conflict Early Warning and Anticipatory Action, debating along the divide of risk of doing harm and the risk of inaction. Juliana moderated that debate and was really meant to be a very transparent space in which we bring together divergent kind of opinions and perspectives on the feasibility of doing conflict anticipation, right? So we heard a lot about the possibilities of doing anticipatory action in conflict settings, anticipating climate shocks, doing it in a conflict sensitive manner. We've heard now from our colleagues the feasibility of anticipating compounding risk and so forth. What can we do in terms of concrete conflict anticipation and conflict early warning? And is that a space we should be engaging in? Bringing back the elephant, Juliana's elephant, because this has been a bit of an elephant in the room, right? Because the anticipatory action community of practice largely was kind of born out of a focus on climate shocks. A lot of the practitioners working on anticipatory action, and also a lot of the organizations, had largely built up these structures to be fit for purpose in the climate context. Anticipating conflict seemed very risky, very political, very sensitive. And I think for a long time, a lot of the practitioners or agencies in this space were kind of shying away and kind of marking conflict off the list, saying it's simply too political, it's too sensitive, too complex, and it's not our mandate to enter here. So we wanted to unpack that elephant in the room and see what has actually been driven in this space. Do we have some first operational learnings? Can we really say that, no, it's really not feasible for us to enter in the space of conflict anticipation, and we should really stick to anticipating climate shocks, and climate shocks maybe in conflict settings. So we brought together a diverse set of speakers from DRC, Climate Center, Center for Humanitarian Data, OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data, that approached the topic very much from the perspective of what are our capacities to model conflict intensification. So what are our capacities currently to predict intensification of conflict? Colleagues from START Network, FAO, and InterPeace, trying to, again, as Juliana mentioned before, bridge the gap, necessary gap between the currently very humanitarian-focused stakeholder group with the peace sector and the development community as well. So we heard from concrete, on-the-ground, real-life examples of how conflict has been anticipated. We heard from the Danish Refugee Council and their experiences in anticipating inter-ethnic, intercommunal conflict and violence in South Sudan. And some of the impact data we've been able to gather also on the humanitarian mitigatory humanitarian impact, but at the same time also the cost effectiveness of acting early ahead of intensification of conflict. And we heard from START Network that has been trying to set up a system to anticipate compounding risks of conflict, leveraging very much an expert-based, more loose triggering process. And we heard from colleagues that presented before me that indeed we need to rethink a bit the rigid metrics that we have set up for anticipatory action with the focus on climate shocks. And then we headed into the heated debate, which ended up sadly not being so heated. Juliana, I think you were hoping for more heat in the room. So that was to Juliana's disappointment. But it shows a bit that we have increasing consensus amongst the community of practice that we can do things when it comes to conflict anticipation, and very likely we should. So what is the current state of play? We have various organizations that have to date successfully tested the feasibility of anticipatory action ahead of predicted conflict intensification. And we have some first impact data and evidence that anticipatory action is indeed a feasible tool to be applied to anticipate the humanitarian impacts of conflict. First learnings that came forward from the Danish Refugee Council, but also START Network, showed us that conflict anticipation cannot be approached in the same way as we anticipate climate shocks. No big surprise there. Obviously, conflict, given the very fluid, very dynamic nature, the very political nature as well, requires a rethinking of how we currently do anticipatory action. So we need to redefine kind of rigid anticipatory action metrics, which includes, for example, merging predictive modeling, kind of our hard trigger logic that we've been deploying so far, with a more community-based early warning system logic or collective expert assessment like START Network is doing. So flexibility is really key. Also, we might need to redefine the geographic scope of action when we look at conflict anticipation. So whereas like conventionally as anticipatory action plans maybe were designed for a predefined geographic area, when it comes to conflict, we might develop these systems for type of conflict, right? Breadth of conflict, to kind of account for fluid geographies that are changing quite rapidly, rather than to really restrict us into predefined districts, regions, geographies. And yeah, need for, I kind of touched on that, need for a mixed method, multi-source approaches to also capture and be able to anticipate cascading risks, and the need to bring new unconventional stakeholders into the room, and that includes peace building actors who are obviously not part of the conventional community of practice on anticipatory action, but very much have to have a seat at the table. So we kind of tried to investigate, like, where does the audience stand? And surprisingly, or not so surprisingly, most were really on the spectrum of, we need to figure this out, right? With conflict being still the largest driver of humanitarian needs, simply saying it's too complex, it's too sensitive, is not really an option. We kind of have to figure out how we can anticipate conflict and its humanitarian impacts. It's the only way forward. So we very much had a audience that was leaning to that side. Now, if we look at what came out of the debate and some of the main points that emerged, or thought patterns that emerged, so on the spectrum of not necessarily risk of doing harm, but the list of questions that still remain unanswered, or the challenges that remain to be figured out, is predictive modeling has proven to be able to detect intensification of conflict where we have seen historical patterns and we have historical data available. So kind of longer running conflict events, but it has shown concrete limitations in detecting unprecedented conflict. So unforeseen kind of large scale outbreak of violence and conflict that is not based on or following any precedented patterns, essentially. So that is a concrete limitation when it comes to the foresight information we have at hand. We need to clearly define the value add and the distinction when it comes to anticipating conflict with longer term peace efforts. So where does one start and end, essentially, and to have a clear value add proposition, essentially, when it comes to anticipatory action in this space. Unclarity remains also around effective or the needed degree of engagement of parties to the conflict. So obviously, as anticipatory action practitioners working on climate shocks, we were very much pushing on, okay, we need to have this scaled into national systems. We have to have these owned by government actors, and we have to kind of like, have anticipatory action integrated into government systems and institutionalized. Does the same logic apply to conflict settings, right? Where governments are often party to the conflict, or where often we have to look at also non-state armed groups, and we have to figure out a feasible way of engaging these stakeholders while maintaining at the same time, obviously, principled assistance, neutrality, impartiality, and so forth. So there a bit of open questions remain. Then also, how do we achieve scale? Some of the successful pilots we've seen adopted really localized approaches, or really community grounded, embedded approaches. How do we scale this? How can we achieve scale while not compromising on this locally led approach? Then obviously, and I've mentioned it before, the current rigidity of AA metrics seems outdated and not kind of applicable to the context of conflict. We need to rethink, reframe, and redefine. And then also we need to better leverage kind of all the capacities we have within the humanitarian system when it comes to response to conflict. So all the expertise on humanitarian access, civil military coordination, and so forth. That expertise we need to better bring on board when it comes to anticipating conflict. So similar to how we started working on anticipating climate shocks, we need to bridge these different sets of expertise and bring a new set of stakeholders into the discussion. Then on the potential or the kind of risk of inaction and no action being not an option anymore, the main arguments are conflict remains the main driver of humanitarian needs globally, right? So if conflict anticipation has proven to work in our first pilots, is it not becoming part of our mandate, responsibility to try to scale this up and figure it out jointly? I think the organizations in the room agreed that there is feasibility in detecting and anticipating the humanitarian impacts of conflict, and there is scope to achieve impact with a focus on that. There's also a lot of potential in layered approaches, kind of like we've seen at times also in the space of climate action, layering anticipatory action on top of longer-term climate resilience programming. Similar could be done in conflict settings, layering anticipatory action onto longer-term peace-building efforts. The adoption of Lex activation protocols, I've mentioned it before, so moving away from hard triggering to kind of more consensus-based, expert judgment, community-based early warning system triggering logic. And then anticipatory action community, I think at this stage, at a minimum, is saying we need to firm up and we need to scale conflict sensitivities in what we do under anticipatory action, be it anticipating climate shocks. But we're at a stage where we need to move beyond that and also look at what can be done to anticipate conflict in itself. Also, key point made was that there are different types of conflict, right? Different types of violence, fragility, different scales of conflict that all come with a different menu of options, what actually can be done to mitigate and prevent impacts. So rather than adopting blanket approaches and taking off kind of conflict as this big terminology that just seems too big for us to figure out, let's disentangle the different types of situation and context we could deploy anticipatory action for, and see who's best mandated to kind of address which type of fragility, violence, and conflict. All right. So in summary, I think we have a consensus, and maybe it's also that just people attended the session that kind of believed in the feasibility. So maybe we had a bit of a biased audience, but I think generally there's an agreement that conflict anticipation must be investigated, right? So it's not an option anymore to say, no, we're not doing this. It's too political, too sensitive. We need to figure this out. Let's figure it out jointly. A lot of questions remain unanswered, so continued dialogue is key. But conflict anticipation as the elephant in the room is gradually being demystified, and it's being demystified in partnership by bridging, communities of practice between humanitarian and peace sectors. But the question was a bit, where are the skeptics? We need them to push us forward, to challenge us. And luckily, we had the man in the green t-shirt, front row, Matthias from Welthungerhilfe, who thankfully challenged us as the one skeptic in the room. So yeah, let's keep this discussion open, transparent. Let's challenge each other, but not shy away from figuring this out jointly. As DRC, and I'll close with that, we are committed to continuing this dialogue and also bringing it to kind of non-humanitarian fora. For example, we're hosting a session with a bit of a similar focus at the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development, which is kind of like a traditional peace building forum. And we're doing it in partnership with UNIDIR, the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, and a range of peace building organizations. So kind of to bridge the communities of practice and bring new actors on board. So looking forward to keep the discussion going. Over.
Thanks a lot, Lena. And I think that was a very comprehensive sort of summary of this session. With to me, it was a very, very interesting discussion. I do agree we could have used a couple more skeptics, I think, to really push some of the topics. But we still saw that there is a lot to explore, and really the willingness to explore this more. I already put the link to the session recording in the chat, because I also saw there were a couple of questions in the Q&A section on how triggers would look like for anticipating conflict. That might stretch the time that we have available for this session, but I would highly recommend for you to check out the HMPW session, because it included 2 sort of Ignite presentations of like, I don't know, it was like roughly 10 minutes each maybe, by DRC and by the START network on some of the work that they have been doing over the last year and are now continuing to do in more detail over the next couple of years. So there are some really nice examples of what the current thinking is, but also what some of the pilot practice already is. So I think that is very informative in terms of where the thinking is going right now. For 2 more insights on what practical considerations are, I will put 2 more videos in the chat, because I don't think we need to spend our last 10 minutes sort of watching those videos together. It would be a lot more interesting to really hear from you. We already had a question from Andy in the chat. If there's any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Feel free to raise your hand for reactions. It is a conversation, so we would also like to hear from you directly. And I guess as the bonus of being here in person, you can then watch the 2 videos that we still have from the Hydrometeorological Institute in Mozambique, and from the FAO West Africa office later on, if you want to have a little bit more details. Yeah, maybe Lena, I can just sort of put Andy's question over to you while everybody else is ordering their thoughts and putting more questions forward.
Sure. Sorry, and I lost you for a second because I was looking for the link to post. Can you repeat Andy's question? Very sorry. Okay. Can you clarify? Sorry. Yeah, it's okay. So yeah. Andy, good question. But essentially how our pilot in South Sudan worked was we had multi-year peace building programming ongoing in that region. So we had set up peace committees at community level. We had this ongoing dialogue happening, and we had established, also trust both with community members, but also actors, government actors in the space. So it allowed us to have one humanitarian access when the triggers were reached, but also we had the community level structure set up and the trust built through this longer term engagement. I think that's super key to have as a basis. Then our trigger model predicted a spike in displaced due to conflict intensification. So that prediction looks 3 to 4 months into the future and predicts a spike in displaced. That merged with community-based protection monitoring indicator that were telling us that community members are starting to face more movement restrictions at community level, then activated the system, which in turn triggered the disbursement of financing, the activation of the action protocol, which largely included intensifying the peace building and social cohesion dialogues in the lead time we had until we were expecting the conflict to erupt further and to intensify. What we saw, and it's actually quite simple activities, right? It's also not very cost-intensive activities. That's why I think from the traditional anticipatory action mindsets, sometimes raising a bit of question marks, like, it's kind of a new way, a new type of assistance, but essentially we saw a de-escalation of friction and violence in the target communities, whereas in surrounding districts, we saw, based on the impact analysis, we saw an intensification as our model had predicted. Those that had been displaced before the peace dialogues were kind of kicked off and started, they had demonstrated quicker returns because they were receiving messaging on de-escalation from family members and so forth. So we had those that were displaced had shorter displacement periods, essentially, and quicker returns. And we also saw really positive outcomes on food security indicators, protection indicators, and livelihood-based coping strategies, largely related to communities that we were able to reach. Not facing movement restrictions means they could continue to engage in their livelihood activities and safeguard or meet their food needs and so forth. So that as to how layered programming can look, and we believe should look. So just as is the case for anticipatory action in climate context, it shouldn't be a standalone tool. It should be integrated. It's not a silver bullet that will solve all our problems, but it can close a necessary time window in the conflict risk management cycle, essentially, if you want to frame it as that. Does that make sense, Andy?
Very helpful. Appreciate it.
Amazing. Thank you for the question, Andy. I think it really highlights this this idea that conflict has forced us to rethink so many elements of how we're doing anticipatory action in essentially all directions. It's how we consider different drivers of risk, it's how we consider the different partners that we might be working on, how we're, as Lena, explained in detail, sort of how we layer it into other kinds of programs, which of course can be related to disaster risk management as such, but then also really on the conflict side being more part of broader peace-building elements. There was one question that I just quickly want to pick up from Anna, if I'm allowed to, Lena, because it might also feed into this a little bit. And there was the question of how this could look like when climate actually becomes one of the drivers of conflict. And I think we have an interesting opportunity there to also think in this direction within the anticipatory action space, because we also see a lot more engagement lately in sort of this overall notion of climate security and how climate shocks may contribute to conflict, to insecurity, where the discussion over the last few years has become a lot more sort of local and contextualized. So I think we've been getting a lot better at really understanding what those connections are between climate and conflict, and quite often those are elements that are already part of local peace building initiatives, because a lot of it relates to resource conflict, it relates to displacement, it relates to conflicts between different livelihood groups. And this has been going on in the peace building sector for quite a while already. So there is a lot of expertise already available. For us, the interesting part as anticipatory action is done probably just to figure out what potential trigger approaches would be. What do we use as a signal for us to say, okay, we have to pay even more attention to a certain area now because of what we're seeing in terms of climate impacts, next to everything else that is already going on in terms of fragility and conflict in that setting. Yes, Lena, go ahead.
Sorry, I know we're running out of time. Definitely, I think that is the next step, to kind of also use all the expertise we've built within the anticipatory action community when it comes to weather forecasting and predicting climate patterns. That is a super useful resource for the peace actors to leverage, right? To better understand how indeed climate shocks drive conflict, drive violence, fragility, and often we have seasonal dynamics, when it comes to conflict intensification. So why not leverage the weather forecasting and climate prediction tools we have worked on enhancing in their skill and accuracy to also inform the peace activities? So that nexus is super interesting to explore, and that's also in our partnership, for example, with Unidir, as something we're exploring, because they've been researching for the past years kind of the interlinkage of climate as driver, for example, oh my God, my English, spikes in recruitments into armed groups, that there's a clear correlation, and also a correlation between exits from armed groups related to, climate shocks kind of easing down and so forth. So super interesting correlations that we're seeing. And I think we as community really can contribute with our foresight capacity also when it comes to predicting climate shocks. So yeah, interesting collaboration to be explored.
Yeah, definitely. Being aware that we're stretching everyone's hour, I think there was one very, very important point that Andy and other people just brought up in the chat, which is just carrying on this conversation. That is essentially why we're having this community conversation today, is to really kick off a broader conversation of where are we at, where do we want to go, what is next, what are those connections that we still want to build. So the Anticipation Hub colleagues already very readily offered the fact that there are going to be 6 dialogue platforms on anticipatory action throughout the year, both on the regional level and on the global one in Berlin in December, where I think we are very much planning to pick up those conversations and make them more specific to the different regions. We also have an event coming up at the end of May in Bangkok, where we are going to talk more specifically about anticipatory action and early warning systems in fragile, conflict-affected, and violent settings. That's always a mouthful, with different actors in the Asia-Pacific region. And so there are a lot of plans to really have those conversations, have a proper check-in of where are we going with this topic, and sort of what are the different new emerging themes related to conflict that we really want to put on the anticipatory action agenda. A very easy way to stay engaged with this, of course, would be to join us in the working group on conflict. I will put my email address in the chat for everyone who does not have it yet. Feel free to get in touch, even if you just want to join the email list to stay up to date on what we're currently doing. We are always welcoming pretty much anyone, as Lena already mentioned, and both Tim and Deborah highlighted. There are so many overlapping topics that relate not just to humanitarians, not even just to peace building, but it goes to development, it goes to research, it goes to all kinds of different sectors and themes. So in a way, we're really using this working group to create our own little community of practice. And we are very, very open to any kind of actors who want to get involved with that. I can also just put a shout out there to the multi-risk working group that the Anticipation Hub has, that is led by my colleague Tess de Boer. And Lena, do we want to promote you guys as well? There's also a new working group that looks at anticipatory action and human mobility, which of course will play a role in terms of conflict-driven displacement, but also looking at mobility a little bit broader, I think. So if anybody is interested in getting engaged with that, Lena would probably be the perfect person to talk to. Anything to add, Lena, or was that a half-decent representation of what you're doing?
Yeah, no, definitely. Feel free to join us. There will be linkages, obviously, with conflict, as conflict is one of the biggest driver of displacement, but it's multi-hazard, and we're looking at the multitude of drivers of displacement. It's co-led with IOM, and the inaugural meeting will be on the 30th of April, end of this month, and the Anticipation Hub will send out the invite shortly, but it will also drop my contact in the chat. For those interested, feel free to be in touch.
Excellent. So that means there's a lot of different venues to keep these conversations going, especially considering we're 5 minutes over time. So thanks a lot for joining us. Thank you to Deborah, Tim, and Lena for being volunteered by me to join me in this community conversation. And of course, to our colleagues at the Hub, as always, for the logistical support for making this happen. Thank you all. Have a good rest of the day. I think most of us will now go enjoy our lunch.
Thanks, Iana.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.